Dr. Baum is a professor of religious studies at the Iowa State University. He teaches classes on African religions and Islam. He has written a book on religions of West African people and is currently writing a book on the religious history of Africa. On and off, he's been living in Senegal since 1973. Since September 11th, Dr. Baum has been doing many speeches on Islam. And tonight we invited him to speak about Ibrahim's children, the remembering Judaism, Christianity, and Islam's shared traditions and histories. So without any further ado, Dr. Robert Baum.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom alaikum. Peace be unto you, my friends. These are common greetings in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. We not only greet in almost identical ways, but the meaning behind them are identical too, that we wish God's peace to all who we greet. I come here tonight in order to talk about the shared heritage of the religions and communities that claim a common ancestry in the person and teachings of Ibrahim. I come here tonight aware of how urgent it is to be a reminder of that common heritage at a time when tensions between Muslim and Jew have never been greater. But I've not come here tonight to talk politics, though if you get me started on that, I could probably go on all night, but to talk about a deeper level of human activity, one far more resistant to change, that of religion and of a shared religious heritage. I come here tonight in the conviction that remembering our shared religious heritage will help to create an atmosphere in which rational, honest, and earnest discussions can take place. We all know that there are people in each religious tradition, all three, who have no interest in dialogue. Indeed, there are people from each tradition, again, all three, whose influence depends on fostering hatred of others. I plan to give similar talks to the one I'm giving tonight at synagogues and churches as well as Islamic communities. We have to stand up against hatred, or there will never be peace. There's an old saying that if an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we'll all be blind and toothless. We have to find a way out of the cycle that seems to be fanned by politicians of many stripes who often use religion as a way of maintaining political power or gaining access to it. If we ever want to achieve peace between Muslim and Jew, between Muslim and Christian, between Jew and Christian, it's going to take people taking the risk of learning to understand our common heritage and respecting our differences. It's going to take people willing to feel the loneliness of being in the middle and refusing to get out, despite attacks from your own religious community, as I felt in the Jewish community, of people who've labeled me an enemy of Israel because I speak positively about Islam. It's going to take people willing to take criticism from their own communities and from other communities to say that hatred has no place in any of the three religions, that hatred is not an emotion that we can associate with religion if all of religion comes from God. Because hate is not a divine emotion. It is a human one of people who are lost. I could talk about this in an academic way, analyzing the category of Abrahamic religions and how the differences between them are less than the differences within one single religion we call Hinduism. Hindus can't agree on whether there's a God, whether there are many gods, or whether there's no God. Yet they all call themselves one religion. Jews, Christians, and Muslims share a belief in the same God. We have different ways of talking about him or it, but what we share is so much greater than what divides us. Let me turn to how I came to this position. I was raised within the Jewish tradition in the city of Washington. I had the privilege of going to a summer camp in the early 1960s that was not racially segregated. I went to camp with the ambassador from Guinea's children, all of whom were Muslim. They were my first Muslim friends and acquaintances. They not only told me a little bit about Islam, but they taught me how to play soccer. Eventually, I became an African historian and a historian of religion, and became interested in Islam again because half of Africa is Muslim. And it's the fastest growing religion in Africa today. The country where I've been living off and on since 1973, Senegal, is over 80% Muslim. Parts of Senegal have been Muslim for over 1,000 years. So we're talking about an area that is not marginal to the Islamic world. I have been struck not only by the warmth and hospitality of Senegalese Muslim friends, but Lebanese Muslim friends living in Senegal. I've spent time doing research in Egypt and Morocco and had similar experiences. And in the Muslim community of South Africa. And since September 11th, the only good thing I can see coming out of September 11th is that I now have friends throughout Iowa in the Muslim community. And I'm astounded by the acceptance of a Jewish professor who teaches Islamic civilization at Iowa State University. And it gives me both hope and pride that if we can talk, if we can study, if we can reason, we can come together. We can defeat this. We can defeat that which divides us because we are all Ibrahim's children. And I must admit the title of this talk is based on a recent book called In Search of Abraham by someone who has compared the treatment of Abraham in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. Now, I've been teaching world religions for probably 20 years. I've taught courses on African Islam for many years, and it's only in the past 5 years that I've taught a course more generally on Islamic civilization. Whenever I begin to teach about Islam, I am struck over and over again by the strong similarities between Judaism and Islam and the tragedy that we are now so bitterly divided. Let me add that for much of our shared history, Jews and Muslims have gotten along well. Except occasional differences, there were obviously problems in the city of Medina, but the problems are outweighed, the problems are highlighted in the text. The fact that Jews and Muslims cooperated in Medina is mentioned, but perhaps not as well remembered, and that the long history of Jews and Muslims that goes back now 1,400 years is mostly one of peace, prosperity, and mutual support. We've had problems with an occasional caliphate, particularly of al-Hakim, of the Fatimids. There have been issues, but most noticeably in the 20th century, it has been the issue of Palestine and Israel that have divided us. But we have to put this in the context of our shared history, our shared values, and our shared beliefs. And when we remind ourselves of that, I think we can begin to reason. I cannot describe to you in words the pain I feel when Jews tell me I shouldn't be teaching Islam, which I hear more from the Jewish community than from the Muslim community. I started my talk with greetings in Arabic and Hebrew. Both wish God's peace upon their friends. Arabic and Hebrew languages are closely related. Salam, shalom. Not only linguistically, but in both Judaism and Islam, the sound of the words is important. The sound is something that God chose. The sound itself has spiritual power and must be said in a reverent way and in an exact way. Arabic and Hebrew are written in similar alphabets that have similar origins. They are both written from right to left rather than left to right. And they both, for those of us who are not native speakers of Arabic or Hebrew, plague us with the absence of vowels when we try to read them. They're both difficult to read as a second language without those vowels to help. There are many words that are so similar. Malik, which is king in Arabic, is melek in Hebrew. Barakah, an important term meaning blessing in Arabic and very important to the Sufi tradition, is baruka in Hebrew. Sadaqah, charity in Arabic, is sadaqah in Hebrew. These words are so close that they are words of brothers, they are words of cousins. Even the word for God, Allah in Arabic is related to the Hebrew word El, which is one of the early words for God in Hebrew. These are not coincidences. This is a shared tradition. So let's move into some discussion of some of those commonalities. One of the most central beliefs in Islam is that of the unity of God, or tawhid. It is also one shared with Judaism. The Jewish statement of faith, or what's called the Shema, reads as follows: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Praise be his name, whose glorious kingdom is forever and ever. If you believe that truly, you are a Jew. How similar that is to the Shahada, the statement of faith in Islam. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. There is no God but God. This is a shared sense of the unity of God. Judaism and Christianity both believe that there are no other gods, that you should not make images of God, that you should not have any graven images lest people worship those images, that God does not have children, nor was God created. God is eternal, all-knowing, and all-powerful. These are attributes of God that are shared in the traditions. This is one area where Christianity is somewhat different, though they too posit the idea of the unity of God, but it's a more complex idea of the unity of God. On the subject of Satan or Iblis, Christians and Muslims are closer together than Jews. Both Muslims and Christians believe that Satan or Iblis disobeyed God when ordered to bow down in reverence before God's creation of humanity and swore eternal enmity to humans because of that. There are Jewish traditions like that as well, but the scriptural traditions in Judaism actually present Satan in a different way. He's kind of a special prosecutor. I tell my students that he's a little bit like Kenneth Starr. He has to ask God's permission to tempt people. When he tempts Job, he has to ask God if it's okay. He can't do it by himself. He's part of the council of angelic advisors or the council of angels to God, but he's always looking to find fault with humans, but he has no independent power. So he's much weaker in the Jewish concept than in the Christian or Muslim concept. Similarly, Christians and Muslims have a similar sense of that Satan is present in the Garden of Eden. In the Hebrew analysis, Satan is not there. There's no idea of Satan until much later in Jewish thought. But Muslims and Jews share a sense of why human beings disobey God. It's not so much that they will evil, but that they're forgetful and disobedient. Muslims, one of the many reasons that people perform salat 5 times a day is as a way of remembering, as dhikr, as a way of not forgetting about God throughout the course of the day, from the first time you rise in the morning and hear God is great, until one of the last things you hear at night, God is great, Allah Akbar. Jews have a similar attitude that you have to follow commandments throughout the day. There are 613 different commandments that Orthodox Jews try to follow every day. And in trying to follow them, it's hard to forget about God. And it's precisely for that reason that there are so many commandments. So both see forgetfulness of human beings as much as the will to do evil, as part of the human condition. On the subject of exclusivity, historically, Christians have held that the birth, death, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ marked a decisive moment in history, and that restores the possibility of salvation, and that only those who are baptized, who've received the sacrament of baptism and have washed away original sin. Only those people can enter heaven. That's no longer the teachings of the Catholic Church that now see Judaism and Islam as acceptable paths, as appropriate paths. The Pope has apologized for the Church's historical hostility to Islam and to Judaism. Some of the liberal churches have also abandoned that, but historically the dominant position is that only Christians can enter the kingdom of God. Jews don't have an agreement about afterlife. Some Jews believe in it, some believe that you live on in the good deeds that you perform in life, and that those bring about the day when the Messiah will finally come. But Jews never insisted that the only righteous people are Jews. Job, who is held as a prophet in Islam, is in the Hebrew Bible held out as one of the most righteous people that God can think of. And he's not a Jew. He's an Edomite. He's from a neighboring people, a Semitic people, but not Jewish. You don't have to be Jewish in the Jewish tradition to be righteous in the eyes of God. This is true of Islam as well. In the second surah, sometimes translated as the heifer or the cow, and I'm reading from the Arbery interpretation of the Quran. It says in verse 62, "Surely they who believe, and those of Jewry, and the Christians, and those Sabaeans, whoso believes in God in the last day, and works righteousness, their wage awaits them with their Lord, and no fear shall be on them, neither shall they suffer." Jews, Christians, and Sabaeans, eventually Zoroastrians, were extended the possibility, if they genuinely seek God's peace, could enter into heaven. In Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, all believe in the equality of all people. I can find no justification in the Quran, which granted I've only read in English, or in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Christian Bible. I can find no justification of racism or of hatred between peoples. That is another aspect of the shared heritage between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But the most obvious is, of course, the common ancestor himself, Ibrahim. All three religions regard him as the founder of a continuous tradition of monotheism. Muslims claim the first Muslim was Adam, but recognize Ibrahim as the first to establish a continuous tradition, an ongoing tradition that connects from him through his children to the present. Jews and Christians claim he's the founder of Judaism. Muslims see him as a Hanif, as a Semitic monotheist. Jews and Muslims agree, and Christians agree, that the oldest son of Ibrahim was Ishmael. There's no disagreement about that. His birth I believe Ibrahim was close to 90 at the time, was something of a miracle that had been promised when Abram was told that he would be a father of many nations. Ishmael is the son of Ibrahim's maidservant Hagar, who was from Egypt. According to the Islamic tradition, because of Sarah, Ibrahim's barren wife, and because she was jealous, she urged Ibrahim to expel Hagar and her son. According to the Islamic tradition, Ibrahim travels with them to Mecca, restores the Kaaba as a place of worship of God, and then returns to his wife and son Isaac. According to Islamic tradition, Ishmael is circumcised by his father, which means in the Jewish tradition, and by the way, the Jewish scriptures agree with this, that Ishmael was circumcised on the same day as Ibrahim. The covenant between God and Abraham, and covenants are the basis of Jewish relationship with God. Treaties between God and human beings. That covenant is fully extended to Ishmael. And he's the oldest son. There's no disagreement between Jews, Muslims, and Christians about that. It means that Ishmael and his descendants, who are described in the Bible as well as the Quran as the people who we now call Arab, are fully part of that covenant, fully part of the blessings of Ibrahim. It is one of the nations that Ibrahim was to be the ancestor to. Jews don't disagree with that. The only disagreement I know about that account, well, there are two. One is Jews were at least unaware of whether Ibrahim went to Mecca. There's no mention of it in Jewish text, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And Jews insist that it was Isaac who was to be sacrificed when God commanded Ibrahim to take his son and sacrifice him as an act of devotion to God. And Muslims insist that it was Ishmael. But there's no disagreement that there is a covenant between God and Ishmael and his descendants, and God and Isaac and his descendants. They are brothers. Their descendants, Arabs and Jews, are cousins. The prophets and the messengers of God of both traditions are shared. Jews and Christians are unaware of the indigenous Arab prophets, the Hanif, who are mentioned in Quran and other Muslim sources. But the great Rasuls of Moses or Musa and Jesus or Isa are shared. All of the Hebrew prophets, all of the Christian prophets are revered in Islam. Jews and Christians are unaware of that. The Quran is one of the best sources on medieval Judaism that one can find. It's one of the best sources about the story of Joseph or Yusuf or Moses or Musa that we can find as well. We don't have many sources. Moses was a Rasul, a messenger of God, who, according to some Jews, received the entire Torah, that is, he didn't write it. It was received, he dictated it, in much the same way that Muslims describe the uncreated Quran. Furthermore, Orthodox Jews believe that Moses received an oral law, an oral tradition that no one ever saw, but that he received and handed down through elder to elder and eventually to the rabbis, which in many ways became the basis of Jewish law in a book called the Talmud. The parallels between that and Hadith and their relationship to Sharia is startling. Judaism and Islam are religions that revere the law and the study of law and see the roots of that law in divine revelation and in oral traditions concerning the messengers who brought that revelation. They are cousins. Similarly, Jesus, or Isa, was a Rasul, a messenger of God. And when I tell my Christian friends what the Quran tells us about Jesus, they are astounded. They're surprised that Muslims believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. But the God who created Adam by speaking, or created Adam from clay and breathed life into it. And there are different accounts of how humans were born. It's nothing to create life within the womb of a woman without her knowing a man. And Muslims accept the idea that God performed a miracle in the creation of Jesus. When I tell people, if you want to know what Mary thought about it, don't read the New Testament, read the Surah Miriam. Because there's far more about the fear and the danger that Mary put herself in by accepting that task in the Quran than there is in the New Testament. We learn many things from the scriptures of the others. And most Christians and Jews don't know that it's there. Now, there's a long history to the way that the Torah was developed, or the Jewish sacred scripture. It was written in many pieces over long periods of time. Christianity's sacred text, the New Testament, was also written over a period of about 80 years with editing and additions. The Quran, in sharp contrast, was written down almost immediately. When the Prophet Muhammad began to recite, secretaries would be called and they would write down what he said. Only the arranging of the verses and surahs, only their naming and numbering were added, and those too were done within a very short time after the death of the Prophet. So there are strong similarities of text and attitudes about text and reverence for text. There's a strong emphasis on law, what Jews call the halakha and Muslims call Sharia. There's a concept of law as not something that you just obey or you try to find ways around, but as law as a way of ordering one's entire life in devotion to God. For Jews, following that law is a way of not forgetting God. For Muslims, it's a road. It's a road toward God's peace that we all have to walk. There was an earlier talk about jihad, but jihad is striving and struggle. But part of that striving is to follow that path that is law, that is Sharia, that is halakha. But let me turn now to history and to the shared history of Jews and Muslims. And here I'm going to focus primarily on that, because if I tried to include Christianity as well, we'd be here all night and well into next week. Let me just mention a few things about history, and then I want to turn things open fairly soon to questions. In the city of Medina, or Yathrib, Jewish tribes were involved in the initial invitation of the Prophet Muhammad to come to Mecca. They fought beside him in the Battle of Badr. Some continued to fight with him throughout the campaigns. Others did become disenchanted. Some even betrayed the Prophet, which of course is true of some of the other clans and tribes that were allied. We have the wars of the Rida against those who apostatized, and we have treachery from some of the clans in Mecca itself. But the division was not simply Jews versus Muslims. There were Jews who sided with the Prophet Muhammad, and there were Jews who did not. There were Jews who remained allies with Islam throughout the period of the early Islamic state. What's remarkable in this history, though, is a concept that develops in Quran initially and then is solidified and expanded upon in the development of Islamic law, and that is the status of dhimmi, or protected peoples. This is a remarkable innovation in the history of the world. We take it for granted in many ways today living in this country, because it used to be that when a country conquered another people, they imposed their religion. They might say it's all right for you to go worship your own gods on the side, but you have to formally worship our God as a way of showing that you are loyal citizens of the state. If you don't, we will put you to death, or we will destroy your temples, or we will do horrible things to you. This happened throughout the Middle East before the time of Islam. It was done by Jews to people known as Idumeans. In fact, King Herod, who was a great persecutor of Jesus, was actually his family was forcibly converted to Judaism by the Maccabees. Dhimmi status said that Jews, Christians, and Sabaeans who had received revelation from God were entitled to practice their religions. That these religions were based upon revelation from God, and while the texts that they had were no longer fully accurate because of bid'ah, of innovation, that people had added things or deleted things or changed things, which, by the way, are acknowledged in Christian and Jewish tradition, that there were editings going on. There are whole gospels of the New Testament that are excluded from what Christians read that we've just found out about, called the Gnostic Gospels. We finally have those complete texts. We know there was editing. No one denies it. Well, there actually are some people who deny it, but they tend to ignore history. We know that in the status of dhimmis, Jews, Christians, and Sabaeans were free to practice their religions, free to administer their own ideas of personal law, free to own property, free to trade, free to enter the professions. Yes, they were not given full equality, but compared to anything that had gone on before the 7th century, Jews and Christians enjoyed remarkable freedom. And the proof is that every small, radical Christian denomination that disagreed with Rome or disagreed with Byzantium or Constantinople are still found in Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Iraq. They're not found in Spain or Portugal where they had the Inquisition. They're found in predominantly Muslim countries that protected the rights of any kind of Christian, whether they believed that Jesus was fully divine or fully human, or two separate Jesuses, as long as they respected the authority of Islam, of the Islamic State, they were free to practice their religion. We have all sorts of very small Christian churches that go back to the time of Paul, still in the Middle East and nowhere else, because of the idea of dhimmi status that developed in Islam. Jews prospered in the Islamic world until the 20th century and continued to prosper in places like Egypt until the 1956 war with Suez, until tensions over the Arab-Israeli conflict reached a point where it began to be difficult for Jewish minorities in the Arab world. But for almost 1,500 years, that was not the case. Dhimmi status offered Jews and Christians and Sabaeans freedom of religion. And using that model, Zoroastrians were given freedom of religion, and Hindus were given protections, not quite on the par with Jews and Christians, but in similar ways. So, dhimmi status, I shouldn't romanticize it too much in the sense that Jews and Christians were not allowed to try to convert Muslims, nor could they hold political office, but they could be advisors. In my own family's case, there's an oral tradition that my ancestor on my mother's side was the court physician to the Khalifa of Cordova in Spain during the golden age of Judaism in Spain under Islamic rule. For the next 800 years, the heartland of Jewish culture in the world was the Muslim world, where Muslim philosophers and Jewish philosophers worked on common problems about ideas of God, and they influenced one another. They engaged in debate. Many of the great Jewish thinkers of the Middle Ages wrote in Arabic. Moses Maimonides, the greatest philosopher in the history of Judaism, wrote his books in Arabic, and then they were translated into Hebrew. Moses de Leon wrote the greatest mystical text in the history of Judaism in the 12th century in Muslim Spain. The golden age of Judaism, I learned it in religious school as a boy. The golden age of Judaism was under, now they tended to downplay the part that it was under Muslims in Spain, but it was in Spain in the Middle Ages. Now, Judaism didn't fare as well under Christians, where there were walled ghettos, there were expulsions, there was the Holocaust. But it's also important to keep in mind that the Jewish and Muslim relationship was affected by the rise of Europe, by the European conquest of the rest of the world, the shift beginning in 1500 from Islam being the dominant world civilization to a Europe and Christendom being the dominant system. The way Europeans expanded, the way they established colonies, was to establish policies of divide and rule. Jews were small minorities in places like Algeria. The French used them as middlemen. They were small minorities in Palestine. The British said, fight against the Turks and we'll give you Palestine. They told the Arabs in Palestine, fight against the Turks and we'll give you Palestine. And then they said, go fight among yourselves and forget about us while we take off your wealth. That's what they did in India between Muslims and Hindus. That's what they did in Nigeria between Christians and Muslims. It's the way that Europe controlled or tried to control the rest of the world. I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been tensions over the attempt of Zionists to create the land of Israel without Europeans, but it got out of hand because it got caught up in the conflicting nationalisms of decolonization and the attempt of non-European peoples to overthrow the yoke of European imperialism. There's nothing intrinsic, I would argue, nothing inevitable about struggles between Muslim and Jews. For well over 1,000 years, Muslim and Jews have lived in relative peace and harmony. If we remember this common history, if we remember the commonalities of faith and Scripture that unite Judaism and Christianity and Islam, if we remember that Ishmael and Isaac were brothers and Ibrahim was their father, that Islam and Judaism have far more in common than they have in differences, then we can begin a dialogue that can bring peace in our time. To those who say this is simplistic, it's romantic, it's idealistic, I say look at South Africa. I started as an Africanist, as part of the anti-apartheid movement. I say look at Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in a South African prison and left prison to become president of a country that he united. I would say look at the way that South Africans, not all of them, but many of them, have put aside the bitter history of racism that divided white and black in South Africa. If we can see that in South Africa, then why can we hope for anything less in a land that is sacred to three great religions that are all children of Ibrahim: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Thank you very much, and may peace be with us all. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers if anybody has a question.
Yeah, one question. As a Muslim, we believe that Jesus will come back as a big sign of power. Jewish people believe the same thing, that Jesus will come back.
Most Christians believe that Jesus will come back in what's called the second coming. Jews believe the Messiah has not yet come. Jews are awaiting the Messiah. So this would be an area where Christians and Muslims in some ways are closer. In Islam, there is a belief that near the end of history, Jesus will come back and correct all the misinformation that has been spread about him. He will defeat the forces of evil once and for all, and then will finally die. According to the Muslim tradition, Jesus has never died. He didn't die on the cross. He only appeared to be, and either God offered a substitute or created an optical illusion, but Jesus was carried directly to heaven and never died. I guess I started that story and never finished it. Jews believe that Messiah, which is an anointed one of God, which in many ways is like the concept of Mahdi in Islam, has yet to come. Jews believe that only through the performance of righteous actions can the way be made for the anointed one of the Messiah to come. They're still waiting. When the Messiah comes, there'll be peace and harmony throughout the world, and we know that that hasn't occurred yet. So that's, in a sense, seen as proof.
They believe that this is one of the big signs.
Yes, before the end of days, yes.
Jews have the same belief that it's one of the big signs of the hour.
There is an apocalyptic tradition in Judaism, but there's also not consensus in the Jewish tradition about that. Some Jews would argue that God made a promise to Noah that he would never destroy the world again, and so that the kingdom of God that will be ushered in at the end of time will be on earth and will not involve destruction of the world, but will be a result of human beings finding their way to have complete peace and harmony with God. So it is different. That's another area of difference. Yes?
Do you please suggest mechanisms that could be used to trigger this understanding among the believers?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear. Could you say that?
Mechanisms that could be used to trigger the understanding among the three religions we talked about.
The question was, are there some mechanisms that we could use to trigger understanding between the three religions? And I think one of them is discussions like this. One of the best things, one of the few good things that has come out of September 11th has been the extraordinary outreach that Muslims have done to try to educate non-Muslims about Islam. I think that's been very important. Most Americans were unaware of the long history of Islam in this country and of the importance of Muslim communities, and they had no idea what Muslims believed. And that's very important. So I would urge you to continue the outreach. I think we also need to create discussion groups, probably starting initially with theology and shared history and values, and saving the trickier issues that divide us for later once we've established bonds of fraternity. And I'm not saying this because I think we need to sort of cover those up. But I think if we build from what we share, then we can tackle what divides us in a very different atmosphere. So we need discussion groups between Christians and Muslims and Jews in non-adversarial ways initially, so that we can begin to grapple with these things. We need people who will stand up to leaders who preach hate and say, this is not our tradition. So we have to speak out to those who are enemies of peace. We need to discuss with each other and share our own religions, share our values, and do it in a way that is not so much aimed at changing them, but is informing. I mean, I'm not advocating that we do what some groups do and knock on our doors at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning and hand you a pamphlet, or at Iowa State where they give you videos about the life of Jesus in the hope that you'll convert. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting heart-to-heart talks about history and about shared teachings and about shared religion so that we know each other before we tackle the hard stuff. Because right now we don't know each other, and that we need to do. Yes?
Firstly, I'd like to commend your courage for giving such a talk, obviously in other places as well. Can you tell me when there was a division of the name of God, El to Adonai or other names? You know, and the division where Arabic has Allah and Judaism has Adonai and Jehovah. So.
I'm not a linguist or a biblical scholar. There are various names used in the Hebrew texts. There's El Shaddai, there's El, there's Adonai. There's a name in Hebrew which can never be mentioned because it's too holy. It's seen as the true name of God, and it's only abbreviated in Hebrew. It's the one that's been anglicized as Jehovah. But the Hebrew equivalent, no Orthodox Jew would ever mention, which I assume is the one that is regarded as the true name. The others are euphemisms. And in a sense, Allah, meaning the God, is linked to that El, but Arabic and in Hebrew and Aramaic gradually move apart. Aramaic actually, in a sense, supplants Hebrew, so that by the time of Jesus, Jews in Palestine were not speaking Hebrew, they were speaking Aramaic. The language of Jesus probably was Aramaic, and Aramaic is actually closer to Arabic than Hebrew is. It's somewhere in between. And the Sabaeans, who are mentioned as one of the peoples who were seen as to be protected, speak Aramaic still in Iraq. Other comments or questions? Thank you very much.